these are the con rods and crank out of my little 659 engine. And this engine is a 2013, which means a couple of things are different. The first is there's no small end bush in the rod. These rods, as you can see on the bottom here, are a sintered rod, which means that they're forged from powder, and when they go to make the end of the rod, they don't machine the ends of the rod and the cap as they normally would. They notch them across the end here. It's got a cast in notch, I think. And they put in a fixture and then they break the cap off. And so you get this surface that is granular, very granular, and not flat at all. So the upshot of these rods is you can't do what you would do to a normal rod, which has a nice flat surface here, and that is you can't resize them or close and hone them. And when you close and hone, you take a skim off here, maybe a skin off here. I don't actually know which one they do. I think they do the cap, bolt them together, and then use a hone and hone the big end out back to the spec. And usually you aim for the low side of the spec. So on these engines, this 2013 and later, you can't resize the rods. And they actually use this rod, I think, in 821s and other things as well. But the other thing is that unlike the previous small block engines up to 2012, which still had only one bearing shell available, which was the old Panther part number, these ones have two bearing shells available, a red and a blue, and this is a blue, as you can see there. I obviously ordered 4 blues for this one because usually you need blues instead of reds when you're trying to get your right clearance, because usually the clearances are on the high side and we want to try and get them down to the spec. The spec will be 0.025 to 0.06 usually for these engines. So what I'm going to do now is put the bearings in the rods and measure the crank, then measure the rods and see what the clearance is. So we'll start by setting the crank, the tool for the crank on micrometer. This is a 40mm crank. All the small block engines have 40mm big ends, and all the big block engines used to have 42mm big ends, but if they use these rods in an 821, then obviously an 821 has a 40mm big end. And that is 40.01. We'll see what this side's like. .012, maybe. So if we can get a measurement this way, just to make sure that it's a bit hard with it sitting on the bench like that. Yeah, 40.13 or so. So it's a fairly, I would say, a fairly well-sized crank. I don't have any concerns about its sizing. Yeah, it seems pretty consistent. So I'll set the micrometer there and call that 40.01. And now I'll set the dial bore gauge to match. So what we do is, with our dial bore gauge, just pop the end of it in the micrometer, and then we set the 0. and you just sort of go around, and that's about 9.8, 9.75, so it's about 2 and a bit. So I'll just move that around 2 and a bit. And we're just setting a 0. This is just a comparator. It's not an outright size as such, it's a comparator. The outright size is the micrometer, and this size you can measure, but its main use is as a size comparator. So we just make sure that it's all the way down to it's a little bit big, a little bit more. Sort of go the 2 dimensions to make sure it's good. Yep, happy with that. So I'll call that 0. Next, I'll put the bearings in the rods. The bearings have been just washed down with brake clean, and then I was taught to wipe them on my arm when I started, so that's what I do. Not sure why these rods and caps have 2 bearing grooves. I think they were hedging their bets on 2 different bearing suppliers or something. It's a little bit strange. Okay, now make sure when you put your rods together that you have the numbers, number 941 to number 941. Without the bearings in them, they would snap together and they would sit. Oh, there we go. Now, because I never reuse these rod bolts, I use the old rod bolts when I'm checking the rod sizing, not new ones. These rod bolts have still got oil on them. 3 of them are oily, and one of them is covered in what looks like assembly lube still. That's one. Can be quite firm to get the shells into these cracked rods, and because the surface isn't a nice straight line, it's not quite so easy. Snap them in. This one is 373. Again, it's this one. This one's covered in assembly lube still. One of the things that was hammered into me when I first started out was the parting surface has to be very, very clean when you put a rod or a main cap on like a car engine sort of thing. These ones aren't so easy to clean because the lube on the rods, I usually put the grease in the holes and grease under the head of the bolt and try and keep grease actually away from the thread, so when you're screwing it in, it's not squeezing grease out between the part lines. So we'll torque these up. These go to 50 Newton meters just for a size check. So what I do now to measure the big end of the rod, let's get the dial indicator, working rather annoyingly around the camera. We pop it in and we bring it down and we just run it through, and you see we've got about 0.055 to 0.06. And that one's more like 0.06. Yeah. Which is definitely on the high side. .06. Yeah. 0.06 millimeters, which is, what's that, about 2.5 thou. Normally I'd sort of like about 0.04, which is 1.5 thou. But these bearing shells, being blues, should be the thickest shell, because usually blue is thicker than red, gives the smallest clearance. So if that's what we've got, that's what we've got. So what I'll do now is I'll pull the rods apart again. I'll make sure the parting faces are nice and clean, and we can bolt them onto the crank. Right, undo the bolts. Now that I've sized them, the original bolts go into the scrap parts tray. And from now on, I'll use the new bolts. Some people reuse them. I think Twine of Bigelow is happy to reuse them. I'm just a bit paranoid about it, so I replace them. Sort of one of those up to you things. Twine does a lot of engines, and if he's happy to reuse them, then I wouldn't doubt that it's perfectly safe to do so. This crank has a plug in the big end, so the big end hole is about that size internally and acts as a sludge trap. So when the oil comes in, it's into the crank, up through to fly out here to feed the rod bearings. This section here is like a dead oil section, if you like, and because the crank's spinning, any dirt in the oil tends to get centrifuged out and it ends up resting against this part of the crank. And sometimes you pull these plugs out, you can really scrape a whole lot of, looks like clay, which basically it is clay, come out of the oil. And even though this was staked, you can see it didn't take much effort to screw it out. And often the stakes sort of do make a mess of it all. Hopefully it won't make a mess of the thread. We'll pull it out. And see if there's any mess inside the crank. I think I've got new ones of these plugs. The plug for the small block cranks used to be smaller than the plug for the big block crank. But I'll have to find out. We'll see if there's any crud in there. You can see there's a little bit on there. So there is some crud in the big end trap, or the sludge trap. So off we go to the parts washer and give it a good clean out. So now let's give it a good clean. Get inside the big end hole with the brushes and see what comes out. We'll see if we can. I think it's clean enough, but you probably won't really see anything come out of it. I did one last week that more than anything I could tell when I was brake cleaning and spraying it out, or brake cleaning and then blowing it out with the air, you could see a little bit of grey residue coming out, which meant there was still some clay in there. But if they've been run on synthetic oils, you probably won't really see too much of that. Traditionally that's a mineral oil thing. If it's got mineral oil in it, then there's just still some dirt in the oil. And also give it a clean through the big end feed holes. Moving through the end of it. I don't pull these plugs out, mainly because I like to leave things undisturbed if I can. I think the last one I did was a Panther, and there was sludge actually in them. I had to scrape right out, so I had to do a whole lot of this sort of thing, but I think there's so little crap in this one that a lot of it is not really that necessary. It's certainly nothing like the old Panther crank. There is an oil hole in the end of the crank all the way out. You can see a little bit of a bubble at the hole there. This hole here feeds the starter clutch, but it's not pushing anything back. The hole on the end of the crank is a grub screw in there with a tiny hole drilled in it, and it feeds a bit of oil out, and the bearing that's in the alternator cover gets that oil. But it's not really. I'll just blow a bit back through there. Oh, coating myself in parts washer fluid. Just sort of run as much stuff through as you can where you can see it, but you can't really get into these passages to clean them out. But realistically, they don't. These ones don't block up. I think we'll call that clean. It has been washed before, but now it's just the clean inside the big end plug before it all goes back together. So the cranks had a good wash in the parts washer, and then a wash down shellite, and then I brake cleaned the holes as well, because shellite's still a hydrocarbon where a brake clean is an alcohol. The plug for the big end, which looks a bit second-hand, is the same as the big block plug. I've got a heap of those in stock, which I keep for 900 engines from the 90s. And with some of the Worth green Loctite, which is sort of equivalent to the old Loctite 270. I'm not sure if you can still get 270 anymore or not. 271 or 272, maybe they updated it to. We used to use it for rear drive pins on BMWs, on the parallel lever bikes. But this is the stuff that does not come out. It's what I use on crank nuts, all that sort of thing. I would certainly rather Loctite this plug in than stake it in, and I usually don't stake them in personally. I just Loctite them in. You need to keep moving with this stuff, because I have had it actually go off like halfway in the past. Something I was doing once, it's a bit of an interference fit, and then I think it was a cylinder stud on something, and then I broke the stud trying to get it out. It really grabs. You have to heat things up quite hot to get it to let go again. That's why I like it. Not sure how far it goes in before it stops. You don't need to go crazy tight with it. Just make sure that it's stopped. I think we'll call that in. I've certainly seen staked ones come out in the past, but I've not seen a green Loctited one come out. Okay, I'm happy with that. To make sure that my rods are ready to go, actually get just some grease, Ducati specified grease for these bolts. Get some grease on a pointer, just fill the threads up with it. It's an open hole, so it'll come out the bottom. If there's too much, that's fine, you can wipe it off later. But if the threads are full of the grease, then we can clean the top off later, parting surface off later, but it means that the threads are certainly well lubed, because we're now going to put new bolts into it. And to stop grease coming off the bolts and into the parting line, I won't really put anything on the threads, maybe a little bit. We'll put some, get threads in here well greased. And then I put some grease or some oil under the head of the bolt, so that it has a nice lubed surface there as well. Might give the bolts a wash. They're brand new, but they're a bit sticky. So the bolts are washed. One thing about washing stuff like this is that as it comes out of an engine, or usually out of its packaging when it's new, it will often have some sort of protectant coating on it. And the problem is, once it's washed and you've washed all the oils and everything off, because all this stuff is mild steel based, it tends to rust. And one issue, because I'm a non-drinker, is that when I touch things like this with my hands, I can then leave rusty fingerprints. And one of the guys I worked for years ago, who worked at, I think he started as a fitter and turner at Ford, and then he was engine assembler at Repco Brabham, and he was a workshop foreman at Ford's Lot 6 in the GTHO days. And Billy said that generally people who didn't drink would leave rusty finger marks, whereas people who did drink wouldn't leave rusty finger marks on machine steel, like even on lathe beds and that sort of stuff. So it's one of the things I need to be careful of if I'm touching stuff like this, is that I may leave rusty fingerprints. Let's try and clean any of the grease off that cracked surface, which is quite annoying. Also, I don't want to leave little rag fibres on there either, but it's a bit hard to avoid it at times. Be a gentle blow off. I notice the shells have moved a little bit in there. There's a bit of residue on that one, I think. Just like to make sure they're absolutely clean of any oil. It was one of those things I had the fear of God put into me early on about everything being clean. Okay, and that is 373. That's 373. That's this one. So the torque spec for these rod bolts is quite comically convoluted. So you're meant to do them to 35 Newton meters at 50 RPM, then wait 2 seconds, back them off, then 20 Newton meters at 30 RPM, then to 35 Newton meters at 10 RPM, and then go 65 degrees with the final torque setting between 70 and 103. So what I'm going to do is I'll go 35, let them sit for a couple of seconds, back off up to 20, then I'll go 35, and then I'll go 65 degrees. But I'll do the 65 degrees with the big torque wrench set to 103. So that way, if I hit 103, if the big torque wrench clicks before I get to 65 degrees, I've got a problem and need to get a new rod bolt. But I've never had that happen. So typically when I'm done, the big torque wrench won't click before I get to 65 degrees. But when I'm finished, I'll make sure they're all above 70 Newton meters, which they all will be. Okay, so I've got 3 torque wrenches, and I'm going to first 35 Newton meters, we'll go first. I'll spin them on with the drill first to get them in quickly, and then I'll work my way through, and this is set to 103. So as long as that doesn't click, we get to 70 Newton, get to 65 degrees, we should be fine. Now, one thing I do is on the bearings themselves, I just put a bit of a blob of this sort of thing. There's also things called engine honey, that sort of stuff. Again, it's one of those things that was taught to me when I started, and I've done it ever since. So just a bit in the middle. You don't want to put it all the way around so it smears out and gets across the parting lines, but it's just a super high pressure lubricant basically. And Ducati supply as tools these little feeler gauge prongs that when you put the rods on, you put these between them to hold the rods out so they don't rock so much when you torque them up. So they should fit. We'll see if they fit on this one. Okay. So I'll put both rods on and spin the bolts in with the drill, and then I'll start the torquing procedure. Got the 941 towards me. Nine, 4, 1. Put the bolts in. One problem here is I only have 2 10mm 12-point sockets, so I'm going to have to swap the sockets around a bit. And this one's 373 towards me. Okay, bolts in. So that one fits, which is 20. Does the 30 fit? No. So the .20 in there. So now we'll go to 35 Newton meters. Okay, 2 seconds to sit, probably more than 2 seconds. Back them off. I'm not going to leave them with no torque because I don't want to get anything in between them. Go 20. Into 35 again. I can't replicate a turning torque or turning speed. I'm not that good. And now we go to 65 degrees. And what I usually do is just put my tool on and line up 65 along the line of the rod there. I'm going to turn it until the 0 lines up with the center line of the rod. There you go. Once again, set it so that 65 is on the center line. I go around to 0. And the gauge isn't, the torque wrench isn't clicking, which is good. So that means we're not hitting 103. And when it's done, I'll just make sure that they've all got 70 on them. If they've all got 70 on them, then they're fine. There we go. So they're all 30 backed off, 20, 35 and 65 degrees. And if I set this to 70 Newton meters, it should click. There we go. So they're all between 70 and 103.